All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to be cracking open a psychology textbook exploring how we learn, how we remember things, and basically how we grow and develop throughout our lives. And get this, some researchers, believe it or not, actually taught pigeons to play ping pong.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what we can learn from just observing animals and how they behave. And you're right, those ping pong playing pigeons, they're a great example of that. They kind of unlock a key to understanding how our minds work.
It's wild, right? So this textbook we're looking at, it starts off by going through some of the different theories about how we learn. And first up is behaviorism, which is really all about focusing on the behaviors we can actually see and observe, those outward actions. And that brings us to John Watson and his super famous, or maybe infamous, Little Albert experiment. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, the little Albert experiment.
Yeah.
It was like a total game changer in psychology.
Yeah.
I mean, it really demonstrated how classical conditioning works.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. You take something neutral, like let's say a white rat, and you pair it with something that just naturally triggers a response, like a really loud, jarring sound. And if you keep doing that, pairing those two things together, pretty soon, just the sight of that white rat, even without the noise, it'll be enough to make someone jump or, trigger that same fear response.
So basically, poor little Albert ended up being terrified of that rat, even without the scary noise, because the rat became like this conditioned stimulus that made his brain automatically think fear. It's like how some people, when they hear the sound of a dentist's drill, they instantly get anxious.
Exactly. It's that automatic association.
Yeah.
And, Watson really believed that this type of learning, this classical conditioning, could explain a lot of our behaviors, like why people have phobias, why we react certain ways around certain people, all kinds of stuff.
Makes sense. So then, we move on to B.F. Skinner. And his work is all about operant conditioning. This is where things like rewards and punishments really come into play, those consequences that either encourage us to do things or, well, not do things. It's like when you train your pet with treats. That's operant conditioning happening right there.
Oh, for sure. Skinner was super famous for that Skinner box thing. It was a controlled environment where he could study animal learning and see what made them tick. He basically found that when you give a reward, or what he called reinforcement, it makes that behavior much more likely to happen again. But when there's punishment, well, you probably won't see that behavior as much. Kind of intuitive, right?
Yeah, it makes total sense. But there's more to it, right? Doesn't it get more complicated than just reward or punishment?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of nuance. Like Skinner found that the timing of those rewards and how predictable they are, that can make a huge difference.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, think about those coffee shop loyalty programs where they give you a free drink after you buy, say, 10. That's a fixed ratio schedule, right? You get that reward after a certain number of actions.
Oh, exactly. Fixed ratio. Now, think about something like slot machines. Put your money in, pull that lever, but you never know when you're going to hit that jackpot. That's a totally different schedule, a variable ratio schedule. And those things are designed to keep you hooked because those unpredictable rewards, they're like super motivating.
It's true. You always think, maybe this time. And that totally explains why those types of games can be so addictive, right? You're chasing that feeling of winning. And then think about how often we check our email. Even when we're not expecting anything important, it's like there's this variable interval schedule thing going on, that random chance of finding a message that makes our day.
Right. It keeps us coming back for more. So it's like even our seemingly mundane everyday habits, they can be explained by these same principles.
So behaviorism is cool, very focused on what we can actually observe. But this textbook doesn't just stop there. It gets into some more, I guess, inside the brain kind of stuff, like cognitive learning, which takes into account all those internal mental processes that are going on in our heads. It's not just about reacting to our environment. It's about how we think about things and try to make sense of the world around us.
Yeah, our brains are busy. Like, think about the idea of cognitive maps. Imagine you're walking through your neighborhood. You don't have to pull out your phone to check the map, right? You just know how to get around. You've got a mental map in your head. You know the streets, you know where the landmarks are, and even the shortcuts.
That's a really good example. And then there's this thing called latent learning, which is kind of wild. It's learning that happens even when we're not really trying or even aware of it. The textbook had this experiment with rats running through a maze. Some of the rats got rewards when they found their way through, but others didn't. But get this, when they finally gave the rats who hadn't been getting rewards an incentive to finish, they were just as good at getting through that maze. They had been learning the whole time, just without showing it.
Exactly. It's
What
like we're
now?
constantly taking in information and kind of building mental models of how the world works, even when we don't realize it. So much of our learning is happening under the surface, so to speak.
Right. It's kind of mind-blowing. Makes you wonder what kind of knowledge we're all carrying around in our heads without even knowing it. All right, and finally, in the whole learning section, we come to Albert Bandura and his work on observational learning. This is all about how we learn by watching other people.
Ah, yes, Bandura. His Bobo doll experiment was a classic. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's where he had kids watch adults being aggressive towards this inflatable Bobo doll. And guess what? The kids who saw that aggressive behavior were way more likely to copy it. It really showed how powerful that social learning can be, especially for kids.
Exactly. I mean, we're wired to learn by watching others. The textbook even mentions these things called mirror neurons, which, get this, they fire both when we do an action ourselves and when we see someone else doing the same thing. So it's like our brains are actually mirroring the behavior that we're observing.
Oh, wow. That makes sense, though. It might be why we sometimes pick up on habits and mannerisms from the people we spend a lot of time around. You know, like how some couples, after being together for a long time, they kind of start to sound alike. Maybe that's the mirror neurons at work.
Uh-huh, maybe so. It's pretty fascinating. But observational learning, it's not all good. If we can learn aggression by watching others, it makes you wonder about all the violence we're exposed to, like in the media, and what that means for our behavior, right? It's definitely something to consider.
It is, definitely. All right, so we've talked about the different ways we learn, the basic mechanisms. But once we've learned something, how do we hang on to all that information? Well, that's where memory comes in, and this textbook has a pretty cool way of explaining it.
Yeah, it uses a really helpful analogy. Think of your memory like a computer processing data. First, you have sensory memory, which is kind of like the initial input, all those sights and sounds and sensations just flooding in. It doesn't last long, but it captures pretty much everything.
Okay, so it's like a super quick snapshot of everything our senses are picking up.
Exactly. And then some of that information, it gets moved to short-term memory, where we can actually work with it and think about it. It's like the computer's RAM. It's limited in how much it can hold, but it's where all the action happens.
So that's where we're actively using information, trying to solve problems, make decisions, things like that.
Right. And then there's long-term memory. That's where we store things for much longer periods. It's like the computer's hard drive. Huge storage capacity for all those experiences, facts, and skills we've picked up over time.
But getting information into that long-term storage, it's not automatic, is it?
No, definitely not. We need what's called effortful processing, which is basically consciously paying attention and putting in the mental work to really understand and remember the material. Think about it. You can listen to a song 100 times and still not know all the lyrics. But if you actually sit down and try to learn them, they stick with you.
Yeah, it's true. You have to actually engage with the information, not just passively absorb it. And the textbook talks about different levels of processing, right? Like shallow processing, where you're just noticing the surface features of something. That doesn't lead to very strong memories. But deep processing, when you're really thinking about the meaning of something, how it connects to other things you know, or even your personal experiences, that creates much stronger memories.
Absolutely. It's like the difference between just skimming a book and really digging deep, highlighting passages, making notes in the margins, and really trying to connect with the material on a deeper level. The deeper you go, the more you're going to remember.
So if you're trying to study for a test, don't just reread your notes, right? You have to make it active. Quiz yourself, try explaining it to someone else, anything to make it more meaningful and engaging.
Right. And the textbook calls this retrieval practice. And it's a super effective way to boost your memory. It's not just about cramming. It's about actually strengthening those connections in your brain so you can access the information later when you need it.
So it's kind of like the more you use a memory, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. And, it's pretty amazing to think about how our brains actually store memories. The textbook goes into some of the key brain structures involved, like the hippocampus. It's this little seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain. And it's critical for forming new memories. It's like the librarian of the brain, sorting through all those experiences and deciding what to keep.
A brain librarian, huh? I like that. So the hippocampus helps us form those new memories, but what about emotions? Do they play a role too?
Oh yeah, emotions are huge when it comes to memory. Think about the memories that really stick with you, the ones that make you laugh or cry or even cringe. Those are usually tied to strong emotions. And that's where the amygdala comes in. It's another part of the brain, and it processes emotions. So when something emotionally charged happens, the amygdala is like, hey, hippocampus, this is important. Make sure you remember this.
So it's kind of like a memory tag saying, this one matters. Okay, so we've encoded the information, we've tucked it away in our brain's filing cabinet, but then how do we retrieve it when we need it? Have you ever had that tip of the tongue feeling? Where you know something, but you just can't quite access it? So frustrating.
Ugh, yes, all the time. It's like it's right there, but just out of reach. Well, the textbook talks about retrieval cues. They're basically anything that can help us unlock those memories we've stored. It could be a smell, a song, a certain place.
Oh, I know what you mean. Like how a certain smell might suddenly transport you back to your childhood or something. It's amazing how powerful those sensory associations can be.
They really are. And context matters too. There's this thing called context-dependent memory, which basically means that it's easier to remember something when you're in the same environment where you learned it. Ever walked into a room and completely forgotten why you went there? And then as soon as you go back to where you were before, you remember. That's context-dependent memory in action.
I do that all the time. So the environment we're in can actually help us access memories. That's wild.
It is. And it's not just the physical environment. Our emotions can be powerful retrieval cues too.
Mhm.
There's this thing called state-dependent memory, which basically means that if you're feeling sad, you're more likely to remember other sad times. Our mood can actually color how we remember things.
So our internal state, our emotions can be like a filter on our memories.
That's fascinating. But what about when our memories fail us completely? We've all had those moments where we forget something important. Why does that happen? Well, sometimes it's what's called encoding failure. The information never really made it into our memory in the first place. Maybe we weren't paying attention, or it just wasn't meaningful to us at the time.
It's like when you're trying to remember a phone number that you only glanced at for a second, it never had a chance to sink in.
Exactly. And then there's storage decay, where those memories just kind of fade over time. Like, you might remember the big events from your childhood, but all the little everyday details, they get kind of fuzzy.
Yeah, it's like those memories are slowly disappearing, like a photo fading in the sun.
And then there's retrieval failure, which is when the information's actually there in your brain somewhere, but you just can't access it. It's like having a book on your shelf, but you can't remember where you put it.
So it's there, but you just can't find it.
So frustrating. Is there anything that can cause that retrieval failure? Well, one common culprit is interference. There's proactive interference, where old information makes it harder to remember new information. And then there's retroactive interference, which is the opposite. New information makes it harder to remember the old stuff.
So, like, proactive interference would be like trying to learn a new password, but your old password keeps popping into your head.
Exactly. And retroactive interference would be like learning a new coworker's name, but then you completely blank on the name of the person who just left the company. Like our memories are competing with each other.
Right. Like they're all jumbled up in there fighting for space. Okay, so we've talked about how we encode memories, how we store them, and even how we sometimes forget. But here's something that kind of blew my mind. The textbook points out that memory isn't actually a perfect recording of the past. It's more like a reconstruction process, and it's surprisingly prone to errors.
Yeah, it's true. Our memories aren't like video cameras perfectly capturing every detail. They're more like, I guess you could say, collages, where bits and pieces get rearranged and reinterpreted over time.
And one example of how our memories can be distorted is this thing called the misinformation effect. It's basically when misleading information, like leading questions or suggestive details, can actually change how we remember something.
Exactly. It's why eyewitness testimony can be so unreliable. Even subtle suggestions can influence how a witness remembers an event.
It's kind of scary to think about how easily our memories can be manipulated. And there's even evidence that when we retrieve a memory, we might actually be modifying it slightly before storing it again. It's called reconsolidation, and it basically means that our memories are constantly being reshaped and rewritten over time.
It's like every time you open a file on your computer, there's a chance you might accidentally save a slightly different version. And that has huge implications for how we understand memory, especially in areas like therapy or legal cases where having an accurate memory is super important.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question how much we can really trust our own memories. All right, so we've talked about learning, we've talked about memory, but there's another big piece of the puzzle here, development. How do we change and grow throughout our lives? And this textbook dives right into that classic debate of nature versus nurture. You know, how much of who we are is because of our genes and how much is because of our environment.
It's a big question, right? And it turns out it's not an either-or situation, it's both. Our genes and our environment, they're constantly interacting and influencing each other in fascinating ways.
So it's not like one is more important than the other. They both play a role.
Exactly. And there's this field called behavior genetics that specifically studies how our genes and environment work together. They do a lot of research with twins and adopted children to try to figure out, which traits are more influenced by genes and which ones are more shaped by the environment. And they found that genes actually play a surprisingly big role in who we are.
So we're not just blank slates at birth. We come pre-programmed with certain tendencies and predispositions.
Yeah, but it's not like our genes completely determine our destiny. Our environment, our experiences, our relationships, our culture, they all play a role in shaping how those genes are expressed.
It's a complex interplay for sure.
Absolutely. The textbook talks about temperament, which is kind of like a person's baseline emotional reactivity. Some babies are just naturally more easygoing, while others are more sensitive and reactive. That's an example of a trait that's partly influenced by genes. But how that temperament is expressed, how those kids learn to manage their emotions, that's where the environment comes in.
So it's like our genes might give us a starting point, but our experiences shape how we navigate from there.
Exactly. And speaking of starting points, the textbook also introduces this idea of evolutionary psychology, which basically uses the principles of natural selection to try to explain some of our common human behaviors and tendencies.
Oh, that's interesting. So the idea is that those traits that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, those are the ones that are more likely to be passed down through generations.
Exactly. So, for example, an evolutionary psychologist might say that our fear of snakes, which is pretty common, it's an adaptation that helped our ancestors avoid getting bitten by venomous snakes. Or they might say that our attraction to certain physical features is a way of unconsciously assessing a potential mate's health and fertility.
That makes sense. But I guess not everyone agrees with these evolutionary explanations, right?
Yeah, you're right. It can be a pretty controversial area. Some people think it's too simplistic and ignores the role of culture and learning.
Right. It's important to keep in mind that evolutionary psychology is just one way of looking at things. It doesn't have all the answers. It's more like a tool that can help us understand some of our behaviors. But we always need to be critical and consider other perspectives too.
Exactly. It's not the whole story. And speaking of different perspectives, the textbook also gets into the role of culture in shaping our development.
Oh, yeah, culture is a huge factor. It shapes so much of how we see the world and interact with others.
Right. The textbook contrasts individualistic cultures, where people prioritize their own personal goals and independence, with collectivist cultures, which are more about group harmony and social obligations. And these cultural values, they have a huge impact on how we think, feel, and behave.
So it's like in an individualistic culture, you might be encouraged to stand out from the crowd and pursue your own unique path, while in a collectivist culture, you might be more focused on fitting in and contributing to the group.
Yeah, and those cultural differences even show up in the way parents raise their kids. In some cultures, parents emphasize independence and self-reliance, while in others, the focus is more on obedience and respect for elders. And those different approaches can have a big impact on a child's development.
It's pretty amazing how much our culture shapes who we are. And then there's that whole topic of gender, which is always a hot topic. The textbook goes into how both biology and our social environment interact to shape our gender identity and roles.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? We often hear about the differences between men and women, but honestly, we're actually more alike than different in a lot of ways.
It's true. We have way more in common than we sometimes think. But I guess there are some consistent differences in how men and women tend to behave, at least on average. And it's interesting to think about how much of that is biology and how much is social influence.
Yeah. The textbook makes a clear distinction between sex, which refers to those biological differences between males and females, and gender, which is more about the social roles and characteristics that we associate with being male or female. And those ideas about what's considered masculine or feminine, they can vary a lot across cultures and even change over time.
So it's not just about our biology, it's about the messages we receive from our society about how men and women are supposed to behave.
Right. And then there's gender identity, which is about our own internal sense of being male, female, or maybe somewhere in between. The textbook mentions this idea of social learning theory, which basically says that we learn those gender roles through observation, reinforcement, and punishment. Like if a little girl is always praised for playing with dolls and scolded for playing with trucks, she's more likely to develop those traditionally feminine interests and behaviors.
It's kind of like we're being shaped by all these subtle cues and messages from a very early age.
Yeah, and those early experiences, they can have a lasting impact on how we see ourselves and how we move through the world.
It's a lot to unpack for sure. Okay, so we've covered some of the big picture influences on development. Now, I want to shift gears and zoom in on one specific framework for understanding how our thinking develops, Piaget's stages.
Ah, yes, Jean Piaget. He was like a pioneer in developmental psychology. He came up with this idea that children's thinking progresses through these distinct stages, and each stage has its own unique cognitive abilities.
So it's not like kids just gradually become smarter. Their thinking actually goes through these qualitative shifts as they grow.
Exactly. And Piaget really emphasized that children are active learners, like little scientists, constantly experimenting and trying to make sense of the world around them.
Okay, so walk us through those stages. What are they?
All right, so the first stage is the sensorimotor stage, and it lasts from birth to about 2 years old. Babies in this stage, they're all about exploring the world through their senses and their movements. They're learning about object permanence, which is this really cool idea that things continue to exist even when you can't see them.
That's a pretty big concept for a little baby to grasp.
It is. Think about playing peekaboo with a baby. Before they develop object permanence, they genuinely think you've disappeared when you cover your face. It's like magic to them.
That's hilarious. I never thought about it that way. So they learn about object permanence in the sensorimotor stage. What else?
Well, around 8 months or so, they also start to develop stranger anxiety. They become more aware of who their primary caregivers are, and they get upset when they're separated from them. It's a sign that they're really forming those crucial social bonds.
So it's a good thing, even though it can be tough for parents when their baby suddenly freaks out around strangers.
Exactly. It's a sign of healthy development. Okay, moving on to the next stage, the pre-operational stage, which is roughly from 2 to 7 years old. This is when kids start using language and symbols more, but their thinking is still pretty egocentric. It's hard for them to see things from another person's perspective.
Well, I remember that. It's like they think everyone sees the world exactly the way they do.
Right. Piaget demonstrated this with his famous three mountains task. He showed kids a model of three mountains and asked them to describe what someone sitting on the other side would see. And pre-operational kids, they would almost always just describe their own view, not realizing that the other person would have a different perspective.
Oh, that's so funny. It's like they can't imagine that someone else's view could be different from their own.
Yeah. And they also haven't quite grasped the concept of conservation yet. That's the idea that the amount of something stays the same, even if you change its shape or appearance.
Oh, right. Like if you pour the same amount of juice into a tall, skinny glass and a short, wide glass, they'll think the tall glass has more because it looks taller.
Exactly. They're fooled by their perceptions. But don't worry, they'll get it eventually.
No.
Around 7 years old, they move into the concrete operational stage. And that's when their thinking starts to become more logical and organized. They finally understand conservation, and they can perform mental operations, like reversing a sequence of events in their minds.
So they can finally understand that pouring juice back and forth between different glasses doesn't actually change the amount of juice. It's a big step.
It is. And then finally, around 12 years old, they reach the formal operational stage. This is where things get really interesting. Their thinking becomes more abstract and hypothetical. They can think about possibilities, they can reason about consequences, and they can engage in much more complex problem solving.
It's like they've unlocked a whole new level of thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And, Piaget's stages have been super influential in our understanding of child development, but modern research suggests that development might be a little more continuous and messy than he initially thought.
Right. It's probably not like kids suddenly wake up one day with all these brand new cognitive abilities. It's probably more gradual and nuanced than that.
Exactly. There's definitely a lot more overlap between the stages than Piaget originally proposed. But his work is still super important for understanding the general trajectory of cognitive development.
Okay, so we've talked about how children's thinking develops, but what about their social and emotional development? That's got to be just as
Yeah.
important, right?
Oh, absolutely. The textbook spends a lot of time talking about attachment, which is that really deep emotional bond that forms between an infant and their caregiver.
Attachment's a big deal, for sure. It's all over the parenting books.
And for good reason. It's crucial for a child's sense of security and well-being, and it really lays the foundation for healthy relationships later in life.
So those early bonds we form with our caregivers, they can really shape our relationships for years to come.
They can. And there's a lot of research to back that up. Have you ever heard of those monkey experiments by Harry Harlow?
Oh yeah, the ones with the wire mothers and the cloth mothers.
Exactly. Those experiments were pretty controversial, but they really highlighted the importance of contact comfort. That physical closeness and warmth in forming attachment. Those baby monkeys, they would cling to the soft cloth mother even though it didn't provide any food, rather than the wire mother that did have food. It showed how much babies crave that feeling of security and comfort.
So it's not just about the physical needs like food and shelter. Babies need emotional nourishment too.
Exactly. And the textbook also talks about Mary Ainsworth and her strange situation experiment, which is a way of assessing different attachment styles in infants.
Oh, yeah, I think I've heard of that. It's where they observe how babies react when their mom leaves the room and then comes back, right?
Yeah, exactly. And based on those reactions, they can classify babies as having a secure attachment, an insecure anxious attachment, or an insecure avoidant attachment style.
So a securely attached baby would be upset when their mom leaves, but then easily comforted when she comes back. But an insecurely attached baby might be more clingy or avoidant even when their mom is there.
Right, and those early attachment patterns, they can really influence how we approach relationships throughout our lives. It's fascinating stuff.
It is. Okay, so we've gone from babies to, well, teenagers. The textbook talks about adolescence as this, kind of tumultuous period between childhood and adulthood. Puberty kicks in, hormones are raging, and teens are trying to figure out who they are and where they fit in.
Yeah, adolescence can be a wild ride. It's a time of huge physical, emotional, and social changes. The textbook describes it as a period of identity formation, where teens are really wrestling with questions of who am I, what do I believe in, what do I want to do with my life?
It's a lot of pressure. And along with all that comes the development of more complex moral reasoning. The textbook talks about Lawrence Kohlberg and his stage theory of moral development.
Ah, yes, Kohlberg's stages. He basically argued that our thinking about right and wrong, it evolves as we mature. He proposed 3 levels of moral reasoning: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional.
Okay, so break those down for us. What do those levels mean?
Well, at the pre-conventional level, morality is really all about self-interest. It's about avoiding punishment and getting rewards. So a kid at this level might not steal a cookie because they're afraid of getting in trouble.
So it's about the consequences for them, not really about right and wrong in a bigger sense.
Yeah. Then as they get older, they move into the conventional level. Now, morality is more about following the rules and laws, maintaining social order, and living up to the expectations of others. So at this level, a teenager might not steal because they know it's wrong, and they don't want to disappoint their parents or get in trouble with the law.
So it's about doing what's expected of them, being a good citizen, so to speak.
Right. And then finally, some people, they reach the post-conventional level. This is where morality becomes more about following your own internal principles, even if they sometimes conflict with societal norms. So a person at this level might steal food to feed a starving family, even though it's technically breaking the law, because they believe that human life is more important than property rights.
So their moral compass is guided by these deeper universal principles, not just the rules of society.
Exactly. And it's pretty amazing to think about how our sense of right and wrong can evolve over time.
It is. But it's not always just a simple progression through those stages, is it? I mean, sometimes our emotions can get in the way of making those rational moral judgments.
Oh, absolutely. Our emotions play a huge role in our moral decision-making. The textbook mentions this idea of moral intuition, which is basically the idea that we often have these gut feelings about right and wrong that can sometimes override our more logical, reasoned judgments.
So sometimes it's more about how something makes us feel than about carefully analyzing the situation.
Right, and those gut feelings, they can be influenced by all sorts of things, like our cultural background, our personal experiences, even things like how sensitive we are to disgust.
So our morality is a complex mix of reason, emotion, and experience. It's fascinating how all those things come together to shape how we make those tough decisions.
Yeah, it's true. Our genes and our experiences, it's all kind of intertwined. And the more we dig into this stuff, the more we uncover about just how incredible our minds are and how they work.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? And speaking of layers, this textbook, it goes on to explore how our early experiences can actually shape our brains, and not just metaphorically, but physically at the neural level.
Right, that's where this idea of plasticity comes in. The brain, especially when we're young, it's incredibly adaptable. Those early experiences, whether they're good or bad, they can actually influence the connections between brain cells. It's pretty wild. And it can affect everything from how easily we learn language to how we handle stress and emotions as adults.
So our brains aren't just static, they're constantly being molded by our experiences.
Exactly. In the textbook, it talks about these things called critical periods in development, which are kind of like windows of opportunity. During those periods, certain experiences are crucial for normal, healthy development. Like if a child isn't exposed to language during a certain critical period, it can really impact their ability to speak and understand language later on.
That's why those early years are so important, right? It's like laying the foundation for everything that comes after.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder of how important it is to create those nurturing, stimulating environments for kids, especially when they're young.
And it's not just parents who have that influence, right? The textbook also talks about peer influence, especially during adolescence.
Oh yeah, peers are huge, especially as kids are trying to navigate those social worlds and figure out who they are. Those peer relationships, they become super important. They learn social skills. They try on different identities. They just want to feel accepted and like they belong.
It makes sense, but peer influence can be kind of a double-edged sword, can it? I mean, it can lead to good things like learning empathy and cooperation, but it can also lead to risky behaviors like trying drugs or getting into trouble.
Yeah, for sure. It's a mixed bag. And that's why it's so important for parents and teachers, adults in general, to understand how peer groups work and to help guide young people toward building those positive, healthy relationships.
It's finding that balance, right? Giving kids space to explore and be themselves while also providing support and guidance to make good choices.
Mm.
I thought it was interesting how the textbook talks about this idea of emerging adulthood as like a whole new stage of development. Like we've added another phase to the traditional model of childhood, adolescence, adulthood.
Right. It's kind of new phenomenon. I mean, it makes sense, though, when you think about how much things have changed.
Yeah.
In the past, the transition to adulthood was more straightforward. You finished school, got a job, got married, started a family, boom, you're an adult. But now, people are living longer, more people are going to college or pursuing higher education, and the traditional markers of adulthood are kind of shifting.
Right. It's not as clear cut anymore. So we have this new phase, emerging adulthood, which is roughly from the late teens to the mid 20s, where young people are kind of in this in between space. They're exploring different options, figuring out their identities, and slowly taking on more adult responsibilities.
It's an interesting time. Exciting, for sure, but also a little bit daunting. And it raises a lot of questions about how this new stage is impacting our society, our expectations, all that.
It makes you wonder how these changing demographics and social trends will play out in the long run. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, talking about learning, memory, and how we develop throughout life. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, that whole evolutionary psychology thing.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a fascinating lens to look at human behavior through. And the textbook, it delves into how evolutionary psychologists explain those differences in what men and women look for in a romantic partner.
You mean like how men are often more drawn to physical attractiveness while women tend to prioritize things like resources and stability?
Exactly. And evolutionary psychologists, they'd say these preferences have their roots way back in our evolutionary past. For men who could theoretically have an unlimited number of offspring, their goal, evolutionarily speaking, was to spread their genes as widely as possible.
So it's like a numbers game for them from an evolutionary perspective.
Right. But women, they can only have a limited number of children. So they were more selective, looking for partners who could provide resources and stability to help ensure the survival of their offspring.
It makes sense on a certain level, but it's pretty controversial, right? I mean, not everyone buys into those evolutionary explanations.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely a hot topic. Critics argue that those explanations are too simplistic, like they're ignoring the role of culture and social learning.
Right. It's not like we're just robots programmed by our genes. Our choices and behaviors are influenced by so many factors.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that evolutionary psychology is just one perspective, one tool for understanding behavior. It doesn't have all the answers, but it can offer some interesting insights.
Like any good theory, it can be a useful framework, but we always need to be critical and consider different viewpoints. Speaking of new perspectives, something that really stood out to me in this textbook was the discussion of epigenetics. That stuff is really fascinating.
Oh yeah, epigenetics is mind-blowing. It's like taking the whole nature-nurture debate to a whole new level.
Okay, break it down for us. What exactly is epigenetics?
So basically, epigenetics is the study of how our experiences can actually change the way our genes are expressed. but without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself.
Wait, so our experiences can change how our genes work, even though the genes themselves stay the same?
Yeah. Think of it like this. Our genes, they're like the blueprint for building a house. But epigenetics, it's like the contractor who decides which parts of the blueprint actually get built and how they're put together.
So our genes are like the instructions, but epigenetics decides which instructions get followed.
Exactly. And what's really crazy is that these epigenetic changes, they can be triggered by all sorts of things in our environment, our experiences, like exposure to stress or trauma early in life. It can actually leave these epigenetic marks on our genes that could affect our physical and mental health for years to come.
It's like our experiences can actually rewrite the way our genes operate. That's incredible. So it's not just about the genes we inherit, it's about how those genes are influenced by our environment.
Right. And what's even more mind-blowing is that some of those epigenetic changes can actually be passed down to future generations.
Wait, seriously? So, like, the things we experience in our lifetime could potentially affect our children or even our grandchildren. That's wild.
It is. It really challenges our understanding of heredity.
Hmm.
It means that our lifestyle choices, the environments we create, they can have a ripple effect that extends way beyond our own lives.
Okay, we've covered a lot of really complex stuff here. It's a lot to process. But I guess the big question is, what does it all mean? How can we actually use these psychological insights in our own lives? Like, what's the practical takeaway here?
That's the million-dollar question. The real value of all this, this deep dive into psychology, it's not about memorizing a bunch of facts and theories. It's about using this knowledge to understand ourselves better, to make better decisions, to navigate the world around us with more awareness and compassion.
So it's about applying these ideas to our own lives.
Exactly. Like, for example, understanding the different ways we learn, it can help us become more effective learners ourselves.
Mm.
We can tailor our study habits to match our learning styles, experiment with different techniques.
And knowing how memory works, it can help us study more effectively, remember important information, maybe even overcome some of those frustrating memory lapses we all have.
Right. And having a deeper understanding of development, those different stages we go through and all the factors that shape who we become, well, it can help us become more empathetic and understanding parents, partners, friends, just better humans all around, really.
And thinking about that interplay of nature and nurture, how our genes and our environment are constantly interacting, well, it can empower us to make healthier choices for ourselves, create environments that support our own well-being and the well-being of others.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive products of our biology or our circumstances. We have the power to learn, to grow, to change, to make choices that shape our lives and the lives of those around us.
It's about taking ownership of our own development, I guess.
Yeah. And this deep dive, it's really just a starting point. The real journey begins when you take these ideas and explore them further, apply them to your own life, and see where they lead you.
I love that. Always keep learning, keep exploring. All this talk about development makes me think about how much things have changed, even in just the last generation or two. The textbook actually mentions this. Like, marriage patterns are so different now than they used to be.
Oh yeah, for sure. People are waiting longer to get married. Living together before marriage is way more common. And divorce rates, well, they're higher too. It's interesting to think about how all these shifts are affecting individuals and families.
And the textbook, it doesn't shy away from some of those tough questions about relationships, like what really makes a marriage last. It's got to be more than just finding the perfect person, right?
Right? Yeah, there's no such thing as the perfect person. But the research on successful relationships, it really highlights the importance of things like emotional intelligence, you know, being aware of and managing your own emotions, but also being sensitive to your partner's feelings. It's about empathy, compassion, being able to work through disagreements without, blowing everything up.
So it's not about finding someone who checks all the boxes. It's about building a strong foundation and putting in the work to make it last.
Exactly. And it's not just romantic relationships that matter, right?
Yeah.
The textbook, it emphasizes how important friendships and social connections are for our well-being. We're social creatures. We need those connections to thrive.
I completely agree. We all crave that sense of belonging and connection with others.
Right. And studies have shown that having those strong social support networks can make us more resilient. It helps us cope with stress, and it can even improve our physical health.
So it's not just about having fun with friends. It's actually good for us on a deeper level.
Totally. It's an investment worth making. Make time for those coffee dates, those phone calls, those heart-to-heart conversations. It makes a difference.
And speaking of investments, the textbook even touches on the financial side of relationships, especially marriage. It's something that doesn't always get talked about, but it's a big deal.
Oh yeah, money can be a huge source of stress in relationships. I mean, financial stress can put a real strain on a marriage, that's for sure. But then again, couples who are more financially stable might have more freedom to pursue their own individual goals and interests, so it can go both ways.
It's a reminder that relationships don't exist in a vacuum. We bring all our baggage, our financial situations, our past experiences, all of it into those relationships.
It's all connected. We're all shaped by those bigger social and economic forces, even in our most intimate relationships.
Okay, we've talked about relationships, the good, the bad, the messy. What about parenting? The textbook talks about how different parenting styles can impact kids.
Yeah, it goes through some of the main ones. You've got the authoritarian style, which is really strict and demanding, all about obedience. Then there's the permissive style, which is more lenient and indulgent, kind of like do whatever you want.
Yeah.
And then you have the authoritative style, which is about setting clear limits and expectations, but also being responsive and supportive, explaining the reasons behind the rules.
So it's like a spectrum from super strict to super chill with something in between.
Right. And the research suggests that that middle ground, the authoritative style, it tends to lead to the best outcomes for kids. They tend to be more self-reliant, responsible, and socially competent.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Being firm, but also loving and understanding.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where kids feel safe and supported, but they also have those clear boundaries and expectations to help them learn and grow.
And it makes sense. But I guess every kid is different, so what works for one family might not work for another.
Totally. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to parenting. It's a journey. You got to figure out what works best for you and your kids.
You know, as someone who's always been fascinated by how our minds work, all those unconscious processes, I was super intrigued by the textbook's discussion of subliminal perception.
Ah, yes. The whole idea that we can process information below the level of conscious awareness. It's like our brains are picking up on these subtle cues and stimuli without us even realizing it.
So it's like those messages hidden in movies or ads that are supposed to, influence us without us knowing.
Well, the reality is not quite as dramatic as all that. While there is some evidence that subliminal messages can have a small, temporary effect on our thoughts and behaviors, those effects are usually pretty weak, and they're easily overridden by our conscious awareness.
So it's not like we're being brainwashed by subliminal messages.
No, not at all. It's more about priming, kind of activating certain associations in our minds that might make us a little bit more likely to think or act in a certain way.
So it's subtle, but it can still have an impact.
Yeah, it's one of those fascinating examples of how our unconscious minds are constantly at work shaping our perceptions and experiences. We're not always aware of everything that's influencing us.
It's kind of creepy, but also kind of cool.
Exactly. It just shows you how complex and powerful the human mind really is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. It's been a wild ride through the world of psychology.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore and discover.
Yeah, it's true. There's always something new to discover about the brain, about ourselves, about how it all works. And it seems like the more we learn, the more questions we have.
It's true. It's like every answer just opens up a whole new set of questions. That's what's so cool about science. It's this ongoing, never-ending quest for knowledge and understanding.
It is. And speaking of quests, this textbook we're looking at, it touches on those really big kind of existential questions that I think we all grapple with at some point. Those questions about the meaning of life, our purpose, all that.
Yeah, those big questions, right? Why are we here? What's it all about? What's my purpose? I think everyone asks themselves those questions at some point.
They're tough questions. And I'm not sure there are any easy answers.
No, definitely not. But psychology, it can offer some helpful ways of thinking about those questions, even if it doesn't give us all the answers. Like, some psychologists emphasize the importance of finding meaning through our relationships, or our work, or our contributions to something larger than ourselves, something that gives us a sense of purpose.
So it's not necessarily about having all the answers figured out, but more about finding what gives our lives meaning and direction.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's about finding what resonates with you, what feels important and fulfilling. And that journey, it's going to look different for everyone.
Right, there's no one right answer. And sometimes that journey can take some unexpected detours, right? I mean, life throws us curveballs, and we have to figure out how to deal with those challenges, those difficult experiences that can really throw us off course.
Oh, absolutely. Life is full of ups and downs. It's inevitable. But it's how we deal with those tough times, those challenges, that really shapes who we are. And the textbook, it talks a lot about resilience, that ability to bounce back from adversity and keep going even when things are hard.
Resilience is so important, but it's easier said than done, right? I mean, when you're going through something really difficult, it can be hard to find that strength to keep going.
It's true. It's not easy. Building resilience, it takes time, it takes effort, and it often involves reaching out for support, finding healthy ways to cope with stress, and sometimes it's about finding ways to reframe our perspective, to see the situation in a new light.
And sometimes it's about finding meaning in the midst of the suffering, finding those glimmers of hope even when things feel dark.
Exactly. And it's really inspiring to see how people can go through incredibly difficult experiences and come out the other side even stronger.
It is. It gives you hope, like no matter what life throws at you, you can find a way to get through it. All this talk about resilience, it makes me think about those times when we feel kind of stuck, like we're not living up to our full potential.
Oh, yeah, I think we all feel that way sometimes. It's like there's this gap between who we are and who we want to be.
Exactly. And the textbook actually touches on this idea of self-actualization, which is basically that innate drive we all have to become the best versions of ourselves.
Yeah, it's like we all have this potential inside us just waiting to be unlocked. But the question is, how do we actually achieve that? How do we become those self-actualized individuals?
Right. It's easy to talk about, but it's a lot harder to actually do.
It is. But psychologists like Abraham Maslow, he had this theory that self-actualization, it's not something you can just force. It's about meeting our basic needs first, those fundamental needs for safety, belonging, love, esteem, all those things.
So it's like building a pyramid, right? You got to have a solid foundation before you can reach the top.
Exactly. Once those basic needs are met, then we're free to pursue our passions, develop our talents, really contribute to the world in a meaningful way.
And it's a lifelong journey, right? It's not like you reach a self-actualization and then you're done. It's about constantly growing and evolving.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's about always striving to learn more, to become more, to make the most of this one precious life we have.
Well said. This whole deep dive, it's definitely been a reminder of that. We've explored so much, from the basics of how we learn and remember things to the complexities of human development, relationships, and even those big questions about the meaning of life.
It's been quite a journey. And, it really is amazing how all these different pieces of psychology fit together. It's like they all contribute to this bigger picture of what it means to be human.
It is. It's given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity and wonder of the human mind.
Yeah, me too. And the best part is, this is just the beginning. The more we learn about ourselves, the more possibilities open up.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the fascinating world of psychology. I hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
And remember, the exploration doesn't end here. Keep asking questions, keep learning, keep diving deep. There's always more to discover.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.